Welcome to the Holy Post. It's become very popular to compare our current political moment with the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s. But what if the better comparison is Germany in the 1920s? A new article by Paul Miller argues that to avoid the rise of authoritarianism, Christians in the United States should do the hard work now of creating an alternative political narrative, rather than the easy work of demonizing one side or the other as Nazis. Then I talked to Lee Camp, the creator and host of No Small Endeavor, about creating spaces for diverse people to have important conversations and why fear is a barrier to practicing godly hospitality. Also this week, evangelicals aren't entirely opposed to science, but just like everyone else, they reject the science that contradicts their politics. Before we get started, the Holy Post is going to be part of another upcoming live event. Exiles in Babylon is a 3-day conference in Minneapolis designed to engage the most polarizing topics in the church today, with conference speakers that many of you will remember from this show, including Preston Sprinkle, Malcolm Foley, Munther Isaac, and our very own Caitlin Chess. On April 3rd, as part of the pre-conference, Caitlin is going to host Latasha Morrison and Malcolm Foley to explore politics, culture, theology, and anything else the audience wants to talk about. And you can purchase tickets just to that pre-conference session with Caitlin or to the entire Exiles in Babylon conference by going to our website, holypost.com/events. And if for some reason you can't make it to Minneapolis, there are also streaming options available. So again, go to holypost.com/events to learn more. Here is episode 662.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is the Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer, broadcasting live from downtown Wheaton, Illinois, where all of the Christian publishers are moving.
Are they?
Christianity Today moved across the street.
Oh, yes, they are across the street.
And then there's us.
Yeah, and there's Crossway.
And there's Crossway. Yeah, they're
Tyndale's a little
Tyndale's
north,
that way, and InterVarsity, IVP is a suburb over. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's whatever.
But we're really the epicenter of it all.
Yeah, well, Scripture Press was right around the corner, and David C. Cook was out to 2 or 3 suburbs away, but then they moved to Colorado Springs in the great sucking sound of 1990.
Yeah, the westward expansion to Colorado.
Which started with whom? Who started it?
Focus on the Family?
That's right.
Yeah.
James Dobson started it. And he said, I can see mountains out my window. And everyone said, that's cool.
And I can see a tax break in my bank account.
And I can see a tax break. That's cool.
It is beautiful,
Let's all do it.
I agree.
It's lovely. Have you ever been to Colorado Springs? Caitlin, if your father...
I used to live there.
If your father is in the Air Force, is there any reason why you would find yourself in Colorado Springs?
Many, many years.
You spent many, many years there?
Yeah, over my lifetime.
You haven't been alive for many, many years yet.
Yeah, by many years, I mean like
4.
6
Oh,
spread
really?
across a lifetime.
Oh, 6 years in Colorado Springs. What do you know?
Like that, yeah.
Did you go to the Focus on the Family Visitor Center and go down the slide?
Yeah, I went down the slide a ton as a kid. I recorded myself
Why is
in
there a
Adventures in
slide?
Odyssey as a kid. Oh, it's like a multi-level slide.
Yeah, it's a big,
Skye,
there's a
it's
big
awesome.
slide. It's the slide to atheism.
That's what I was wondering. It's the slippery slope they're always more worried about, right? It's the cultural slippery slope.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is. And at the bottom, they just poke kids with a sharp stick and say, see, kids, you don't want to do this.
And they're dressed like a devil.
Yeah. Poke, and it's really hot there at the bottom of the slide. You don't want to, so stay away. And now it's time for the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin.
This episode is sponsored by Rocket Money. Hey, if you're like me, you want to use your money to do good in the world, to support causes you really believe in. But by the end of the month, your money's all gone. Maybe it's because, like me, you've got like 50 subscriptions, half of which you don't even remember signing up for. That app for your kids that they used like once, that delivery service, the fitness plan that didn't work out so well. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills and free up money for the things you really care about. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has helped save its members an average of $740 a year with over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. I can see all my subscriptions in one place, and Rocket Money will help me cancel the ones I'm not using with just a few taps. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/holypost. That's rocketmoney.com/holypost. rocketmoney.com/holypost. And thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this episode.
This episode is being sponsored by Glorify, the #1 Christian daily devotional app. Look, we all need help engaging with Scripture and integrating our faith into our daily lives. With Glorify, you can start your morning by reading the Bible passage of the day, dive into Glorify's daily devotional, and wrap up with an immersive experience called Daily Walk with God. And because March is Women's History Month, Glorify will be celebrating women of faith all over the world, highlighting their stories, challenges, joys, and the role faith plays in their lives. So if you're a woman looking for an encouraging resource, now's a great time to get the Glorify app. Of course, it's not just for women, but it's for men too. And the content this month can help men celebrate and encourage the women in our lives as well. Visit glorifyapp.com/holypost right now to download the Glorify app for free. That's glorify-app.com/holypost to download the Glorify app right now, absolutely free. Again, it's glorify-app.com/holypost.
Okay, I have not been down the slide, but I have been to the visitors center. So,
Why didn't you go down the slide?
Is it for kids only?
Probably not. He's Phil Vischer. They would let him.
I know they would let me, but I didn't want to. I didn't. It's
not dignified?
No, I'm just.
Yeah, he seems concerned.
Yeah, I am dignified. I'm a personality who must be respected and considered serious and to be taken as such.
And now it's time for News of the Butt. Is that what you're about to say?
No, I'm not. Are evangelical clergy outliers on science? Oh, the answer? Do you know what the answer is, Caitlin?
It might surprise you.
Yes and no.
I don't know.
Yes and no. According to the National Survey of Religious Leaders, 78% of white evangelical clergy reject the assertion that human actions are the cause of climate change. 78, why that's almost 80. That's nearly 80%. That's funny. Isn't that roughly the amount of white evangelicals that voted for Donald Trump in the last three elections?
Was it 82, 83%?
Yeah, 81, 82.
Yeah.
It seems to line up almost exactly with the percentage of white evangelical clergy that reject anthropomorphic climate change is when the climate starts looking like a person. Anthropic climate change is climate change caused by humans. And if you follow Jesus, you must reject it.
In America.
That's what, just in America. Yeah. And just if you're white. If you're white and you follow Jesus in America, you must reject anthropic, not anthropomorphic. That's where I turn the climate into a puppet and I talk through the climate. That's fun. By contrast, only 27% of Black Protestant clergy and 21% of liberal or mainline Protestant clergy reject anthropic climate change. Are you okay?
I don't know what happened. I got something in my throat.
And Skye objects.
Sorry.
Oh, I object, sir.
Wait, but also only 29% of Catholic clergy.
Oh, did I skip that one?
Well, I'm looking at the graph.
Oh, okay. Do you want to walk it off? Do you need to take a little walk?
Oh, it's almost like a bug flew into my throat.
Maybe it did here at our well-kept new studios. By contrast, most clergy, including white evangelicals, endorsed a medical approach to treating depression in addition to a spiritual approach. The study found that 87% of evangelical clergy say they would encourage their congregants to seek help from a mental health professional when suffering from depression. Okay, that's interesting. So it doesn't seem to be that we have a problem with science. It seems to be we have a problem with science that goes against the political narrative.
So climate science is suspect, but psychological science is okay.
And like, should I treat my cancer? And should I treat it with medicine or just prayer or just, by rubbing two sticks together and then holding them over my heart, which wouldn't work. But
maybe the better analogy would be what caused your cancer. It wasn't smoking 4 packs a day. It's just how the world goes.
It's anthropomorphic cancer.
Right.
I made it a puppet. The contrast between the two views of science, the rejection of climate science, but the acceptance of medical science, is striking, and researchers suggest one motivating factor.
I can't imagine what it is.
Politics. Wow. I was thinking they were going to say seed oils or something else, but they said politics.
Phil's been on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
So this would, Robert P. Jones was interviewed for this story in Religion News Service. He said, climate change has been politicized in a way that mental health has not. So it's not that evangelicals don't believe in climate science, and they do believe in the science behind medications and psychological counseling. It's that rejecting climate change has been established as a necessary tribal partisan belief in a way that rejecting mental health treatment has not.
Okay, but so what this seems to be saying is that the final arbiter on what white evangelicals believe is going to be determined by political allegiance, right? Rather than science, evidence, or maybe even
determined by your tribe.
Yeah, your political tribe, your political allegiance. Is that?
Oh, Caitlin says nay. Caitlin says nay.
No, I think
Skye.
yes, but I do think this is one of those instances where there is some blame to be shared across groups of people. And it's really easy to look at this and go, oh, well, white evangelicals are doing what everyone, if we're being honest, is doing, which is having their partisan preferences shape their beliefs more than the things they claim to hold more deeply, like religion or any other kind of, basic ideological commitments. Well, there's a really interesting book about this called The Nature of the Religious Right by Neil Pogue, where he goes through some of this, 20th century history on this. And one of the things I found so striking, when I read that book a couple years ago, I thought it would tell basically that story of yes, evangelicals had some heritage of environmentalism. The environmental movement in the US has really deep religious roots, actually, like a lot of progressive causes in the United States. But somewhere along the way, as evangelicals got kind of looped in with the Republican Party mid-20th century, their views came to be determined by Republican Party views. And he makes part of that argument, but he also makes pretty clear that especially in 60s, 70s, when Earth Day is starting, when the environmental movement is taking on a particular shape, there was such heavy anti-religion rhetoric in that movement that put honestly unfair blame on religion, particularly Protestantism, for having an extractive mentality towards creation that was not one of care for creation, that didn't rightfully acknowledge the whole broader Christian history of thinking of creation in terms of stewardship and care and worship to God. And some of the stuff that came out, especially around Earth Day in the 70s, was pretty explicitly anti-religious. And he, as a historian, argues, really pushed evangelicals, as they're already getting a culture war mindset in that period, to viewing particularly environmental concerns as a whole, but especially climate change, as an issue where they needed to be on the Republican side of this, because the alternative, they bought into the marketing. To be religious means to not care about creation. Sure, well, then we'll go along with that too. And so I just say that to say, sometimes when people are getting overwhelmed with stories of white evangelicals having unfair political opinions or having their religious beliefs be shaped more by political opinions than vice versa, I do think it's helpful to sometimes go, that's overwhelmingly our fault, and we should take responsibility for that and lament. And also, some of this political history is pretty complicated, and some of it does come from a context in which it was really heavily fed to Christians and non-Christians, that divide was just inherent.
Is it another way of saying that the early environmental movement in the 60s and 70s was largely populated by hippies?
It was a little hippie.
It was hippie.
It was a little hippy-dippy.
And conservative white evangelicals were not.
We were not pro-hippie.
They're not pro-hippie.
I remember my grandfather. Look at those guys.
So what you really have is negative polarization, where if the hippie left is pro-environment.
If my enemy is for it,
right,
I am against it.
Right. And you see that in multiple areas, not just environmentalism.
And if the hippie left is saying, yes, to be a Christian, to be religious at all, is to be against the environmental movement, that's a tough environment then for Christians to thrive in.
Right.
Not that places, no blame on us.
If you're demonizing extractive economies and also colonialism, or even some, going so far as to demonize capitalism
Right.
as a whole. And especially if you're in the Cold War, the tail end of the Cold War, where capitalism is part of the good guys that are opposing godless communism. So if you've made saving the earth appear to be closer to godless communism than to Jesus's own capitalism, because Jesus minted money and sold his goods to the highest bidder, as we all know, then it's pretty easy to see where, you're looking at a list of things that I should be for and against.
Yeah.
It's like a voter's guide. It's like, then you get the voter's guide and says, these are the issues you should care about. Boop, 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 boop. And, guess what? This candidate cares about all the issues you care about. And the other one doesn't care about any of the issues you should care about.
Right.
It's package ethics.
Right. Exactly.
Exactly.
But I appreciate Caitlin's historical context for all this. It isn't just that white evangelicals don't believe in climate change because they're Republican. It's because there was a history where this issue became politically divisive, and there was a bundle of packaged ideas, including capitalism and free markets and on, that all went with the Republican side that also was not hippie and pro-environment and blah, 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 blah.
I've raised this point before, though, that there's also the factor that the heart of American Christianity in the Bible Belt overlays rather neatly with the parts of the country that are most that employ the most people in the petrochemical industry. So that if you're saying, we want to shut down big business, that the extractive businesses, well, jeepers, Houston, Louisiana, all across the Southeast, you've got a lot of extractive businesses, and those people are giving money in their local churches and their elders. And so again, and this is, I think, is the case wherever you have, like an industry town. Like if you're a pastor in Michigan and someone starts railing against cars, you might not last very long. As if you start railing against cars, you're not going to last very long in Michigan. Or unions, you're not going to last very long in Michigan.
But it's not like railing against petrochemicals. It's even saying, I think those scientists on global warming, they maybe have a point we should listen to. And like you can't
but what started first? What came first? That did not come first. People being hypersensitive about, let's just hear what they have to say. What came first is, we're ruining the planet and you have to stop driving your cars.
Right.
And you have to, your SUVs are evil, and gas is evil, and extractive industries are evil. So that, and those were, and the Greenpeace movement and PETA throwing red paint on your fur coat. And it was all one big package of, they hate us. Those leftists hate us. And so we have to kind of circle the wagons and figure out what we're protecting. And we're protecting real America, real American jobs, and Christianity, and Jesus. Jesus and oil. Jesus and John Oil. My new book. Caitlin?
Yikes.
Do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I just want to say there is some good news in this, which is that sometimes when we believe an overly simplistic narrative that, for example, Christians or evangelical Christians in particular are just anti-science ideologically, and that we believe there is this real divide between faith and science, we, come into conversations about something like climate change, assuming we know the terms that the conversation will take, and then we're not very effective in trying to persuade anyone or understand where they're coming from, because we just kind of come in and say, well, I know what we're doing. We're having a science versus anti-science conversation. And two, if it's not actually that, if there's complicated historical, political reasons why more evangelicals tend to be skeptical of human causes of climate change than the average population, then that means we actually have some opportunities. If it's not so deeply tied to foundational theological beliefs, we actually have some opportunities to say, like, here are the other things you care about. Here are other areas where you don't think science conflicts with faith. Here are areas where you really care about creation. And here's passages that can line up with that. Doesn't mean you'll always be able to persuade everyone, but if it is largely shaped by these kind of historical political forces, I think there's some more opportunities. Like, I heard a story once of a theologian who was trying to counsel some people who were trying to get some local evangelical, more conservative people interested in some conservation efforts. And they basically came in very heavy-handed with like, here's the science, here's why you're wrong, really tried to shut them down. The conversation, not surprisingly, didn't go anywhere. But when they came in and said, talk to us about what you love about the land that you live on, talk to us about the hunting and the fishing that you love, which was not the kind of culture of the scientists that were involved in this conversation. They're not like hunters, fishers, like a part of that. But once they said, like, talk to me about this land that you love and your connection to it, that was an entry point to say, okay, well, then let us tell you, now that we understand where you're coming from, how some of the work that we've done and the perspective we have could help you enjoy that longer and really honor that, and even use some kind of religious language to say, like, you care a lot about creation and God making this land and giving it to you. Here's ways that we can do that better. We just have better entry points, I think, given this information than we might have if we thought we had to tackle this whole giant faith versus science thing to even get into the conversation about climate change. If we don't have to do that, I think that actually could be surprisingly good news.
You're describing just a savvy, tactical way of approaching things and a neighborly way of doing it. And
an honoring way.
An honoring way. I think the other thing, though, is that the left used to have this argument that conservatives were anti-science. I'm not sure they have that argument anymore because there's plenty of mud on their faces as well. And it's clear that highly politicized groups view science through that lens of politics. On the left, it's not just on the right.
Right.
And so that makes the whole conversation a lot more muddled than it used to be.
Right. Well, if anyone says the new positions on gender are science-backed, for example, you go, oh, can you show me the science, please? Well, here's a group of doctors who've agreed with this statement. Well, that's different than science.
Yeah.
That's a vote. That's a popularity contest. So we all do it. Okay. Now we got something meaty to chew on. Meaty. Okay. This is meaty. Okay.
Real meat or like
real
impossible meat?
Meat. Our friends at the Dispatch. No, not impossible meat, because that code's leftist. So I don't go for that.
Okay.
I need to see the source of my meat fall over on its side and breathe its last breath. Or I don't believe it.
What steak restaurants are you going to?
Yeah.
I'll take that one.
He fell over. I'll eat him. Paul Miller, who has been on the show, wrote a piece for The Dispatch entitled, somewhat provocatively, A Confessing Church for America's Weimar Moment. So this is interesting because it's got a picture of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And at first I thought, oh no, here we go. And the reason I thought, oh no, here we go, is that when Christians invoke Dietrich Bonhoeffer, it means they're calling somebody a Nazi. So the question is this a rightist view of the world where we're calling, the Columbia University and their thought patrol or protest patrol, are they the Nazis? Or is this a leftist view of the world where Trump and Musk and all those guys are the Nazis and we're supposed to resist them? And since it's the Dispatch, I was like, wow, it could go either way. I don't know. They're kind of centrist. So, and then I read it. I was like, oh, that's not what he's saying at all.
Yeah, although
that's not what he's saying at all. He did invoke Bonhoeffer, but the point is interesting.
Yeah, but
yes,
the side that's more commonly known for doing the Sig Heil, I'm saying, is a little bit closer to the Nazis.
Yeah,
that's all.
Don't break the centrism.
Okay,
Skye. Dietrich Bonhoeffer and a small number of other German Protestant leaders gathered, calling themselves the Confessing Church. They issued the Barmen Declaration in 1934, affirming the church's independence from the Nazi government, which tried to force them to join an official Reich Church. They were right to do so, but the Nazis were so entrenched by that point and so powerful that it didn't really work. Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church were ultimately too late. Where were Bonhoeffer, and this is where it gets provocative and more interesting, where were Bonhoeffer and the other leaders of the Confessing Church before the Nazis came to power in 1933? Where were they during the days of the Weimar Republic when they might have made a difference? For all their later heroism, they failed to see the growing threat to the Republic when it might still have been saved. If the Confessing Church was right to assert its independence and public witness against the Nazis in the 1930s, it would have been even better to do so earlier in the 1920s before the Nazis came to power, but while the Republic was tottering under the onslaught of extremists from all sides. And then, so he's basically saying, why do we keep talking about 1933? And where were you? What would you have done? And is this our 1933 moment? And, on the right, people like Eric Metaxas have made this very explicit in saying, we are in our 1933 moment and we know who the Nazis are and it's Joe Biden. He said that a couple of years ago. Joe Biden and his administration are the Nazis, and we are the Bonhoeffer, the people on the right. And of course, now the chorus is pretty loud. Oh, the Nazis are the ones making suspicious salutes at CPAC and that are controlling what we can teach at schools and are pulling books on Rosa Parks out of school libraries. Those are the Nazis. And then we all say, yes, the other side. We're all convinced that the other side are the Nazis. And what he's saying is back up. Let's not talk about 1933. He says, maybe we're not living through the Nazi regime in 1933, but through the Weimar Republic of 1923. 10 years before the Nazis took power, Germany was governed by a shaky republic. Military defeat, World War I, for those of you keeping score at home, led to the fall of the Kaiser, Wilhelm II. Civil war was in the air, and the conflict at the time was communists on one side and then right-wing paramilitaries on the other side. The Republic was hastily patched together, the Weimar Republic, as the only alternative to war and revolution. Economic turmoil and international humiliation were fertile soil for political extremism. Communists on the left, fascists on the right.
And we're stuck somewhere in the middle.
Stuck in the middle with you. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you.
Jokers on the left, fools on the... What's that?
That was alarming.
Yeah,
that was alarming.
Right, here I am. Yeah, stuck in the middle. Yeah, whatever. For both groups, political morality came down to one act: vote the party line. If you wanted to have a meaningful impact, you didn't want to waste your vote on the weak and incompetent center. The Social Democrats, who were in the middle at the time, were not enough to hold back the communist menace. Only the Nazis were capable of reversing the leftward slide. And if you thought the communists were the greater evil, you felt a moral duty to vote for the Nazis. And if you worried about the fascists, of course, you needed to be a communist. You needed to support the communists because they were the only ones who could stop the fascists.
Doesn't this seem... when I was reading this, it just creeped me out how similar it feels to the rhetoric today.
Yeah.
Right? So regardless of which side you think is the greater menace, what you keep hearing from people is, well, you have to vote. You have to vote for the other side.
Yes, you have to offset that evil because
you only have two options.
You only have two options, and that one is so evil. So evil.
And you hear this from both sides.
You do.
Clearly.
You do. So this dynamic of, oh, those guys are the evil. The real threat is over there, so you have to be with us. This dynamic, you would find yourself drawn always further to the right or further to the left. We know how the story ended in Germany. The fascists proved more immediately murderous and destructive, unleashing global war and genocide, but their defeat enabled the triumph of the communists throughout Eastern Europe for the next half century, complete with their own concentration camps and a more long-lived totalitarianism. Neither extreme was the answer.
Just making sure people follow this if they don't know the history.
Yeah.
So you have communists in Germany and you have fascist Nazis in Germany, and the country is split over which is the greater threat. And what the German people basically decided in the 1930s is the communists were the bigger danger. And so moderate Germans voted for the Nazi party.
Yep.
And we know what happened. You get World War II, you get the Holocaust, you get
And one of the reasons that Hitler was able to demonize Jews so effectively to the nice church-going Germans is that the Jewish avant-garde, which was very present in major cities like Berlin, was highly associated with the communist movement.
Right.
So you had, when he would talk about the kind of art that they needed to stomp out and the kind of theater that they needed to stomp out because it was undermining strong German values, it was often the kind of art and kind of theater that was being put on by avant-garde Jewish artists who were also communists. Mm-hmm. So it became easy to create, the communists are the greater evil. And by the way, one of the reasons, and this was one of his theories, one of the reasons the Germans lost World War I was because of communist sympathies among Jewish citizens, that they didn't fight effectively against the others because they liked Russia. They liked the communist movement in Russia. Anyway.
One last thing, though. Before we go,
and there's more, but wait, there's more.
Well, but this is the lesser of two evils argument. And I think it's David French who likes to say the lesser of two evils is still evil.
Yes, but less evil.
But that's the point. It's still evil. And for a Christian, that should create a moral dilemma, because if you want to go back to 1930 Germany and go, well, the communists are evil and the Nazis are a little less evil, so let's throw our support behind the Nazis.
Yes.
You've just created a terrible, evil regime that does awful stuff.
You couldn't have known that.
Yeah, but his point is the Nazis do their thing, evil.
Yeah.
They're defeated at the end of World War II, which then created a vacuum in Eastern Europe for the communists, who then did their evil thing. So the two evils both got expressed because there was no legitimate option in the middle.
And he says there were clearly visible signs, not in what those two extremist groups said, but in how they behaved.
Yeah.
That you could see the writing on the wall.
Right.
That these were both movements that would set aside human rights for political power.
Right. It was no secret.
Caitlin would like to speak.
I would. I mean, the part about this piece that I appreciated the most was not just, as you both have been describing, this like lesser of two evils, or really it's often I'm exaggerating the evil of one side in order to justify anything on the other side, which is why I think we have to be wary, even if there is great evil. Like sometimes I feel like in the lead up to this last election, there were times when we said, let's not say things that are not true about the Republican Party, about the Trump campaign. And people would say, no, but it's really bad. And it's like, there's a lot that's really bad. So we don't actually need to exaggerate or make things up. But also the wariness I had with some of the existential rhetoric was not that I didn't think it was serious. It was that existential rhetoric can then justify not criticizing the other side or going along with things that are deeply immoral or evil. And I appreciated, but on top of that in this piece, he's saying we have this desire for moral clarity that leads us to make these kinds of judgments or exaggerations, because we would prefer to be at this point of crisis where it's like, do I go along with the genocidal Nazis or do I make this Christian stand? It's kind of like when I was in high school and there was so much emphasis on, like, what if someone came to your school and put a gun to your head and said, do you believe in Jesus?
The Columbine
And it's
thing.
like, that moment of crisis,
we love it.
It's actually clearer what you would do.
Yeah.
Like it's actually easier to make the dramatic statement at that point. It's much harder to say, like, am I being a Christian in the ways that do cost me something, that do require sacrifice, but are smaller and everyday? That's actually a much harder decision to make. And I think the same needs to be said politically. We prefer that sense of moral clarity over dealing with the complexities of politics in a fallen world. And I think the piece there's moments I don't think it holds the tension exactly how I would like it to, but I do think one of its greatest contributions is we have this desire for moral clarity. Doing politics in a fallen world, which we need to do as Christians, is going to mean that we don't have that sense of moral clarity. But then the question becomes, when is it in a certain sense, I am always dealing with a lesser of two evils. There's no perfect, morally pure option ever. But when does it ride over into, okay, no, I can't support either of these, or no, these are not acceptable options? That's like a really hard contextual question. And the places I felt most discomfort in the piece was when he was asking, like, could you have rightfully supported this regime before it got to the place where it was really bad? We're always making decisions like that we don't know the outcome entirely. We don't know what the consequences will be. What I wish had been a little more clear in the piece is we're always going to be making lesser of two evil decisions when it comes to policy, right? There's no candidate that's going to support everything I think a Christian should support. So we're going to make strategic choices about what kind of authority they have, what are realistic policy options that could get passed, things like that. What shouldn't be kind of up for grabs, lesser of two evils, is, well, everyone has a really low view of human beings, or like both of these options want to steamroll over their opponents, or both of these options are lying and cheating and stealing. Like those are the things I wish we would say, you should see where this ends up. If they're willing to cut these corners now, they're going to cut bigger corners later. But if the question is, well, I can't compromise on any single policy issue, or I could end up supporting someone that's genocidal, well, no, you're going to have to make decisions about policy options. But you shouldn't be making those decisions based on, well, I agree with them on some things. They're constantly threatening and dehumanizing their opponents, but I just have to go along with it. Like, no, that should be a real place of no lesser of two evils. But when it comes to the messiness of just like policy questions, we can't just wait for perfect moral clarity or perfect moral purity.
I think what's weird right now in the moment we're in, though, in America, is it used to be that we all had our political differences and preferences, but the line was we would only nominate and elect leaders who actually support the Constitution of the United States. That line has now been crossed. And that's what's crazy in my head. It's like, I never thought I'd see the day where a significant majority of this country would support a candidate who flagrantly and repeatedly has disregarded the Constitution.
Okay, can I get back to the article?
Yeah, we can go back.
Yeah, I don't even know where you're driving.
I'm just saying it's like we're beyond the hypothetical, I think, in his argument in the piece.
Okay, so Paul Miller and his co-author, Michael Renaud, I think that's how you say his name, but I'm probably wrong.
Like the car?
Ask the simple question. No, it's not spelled that way. What would a confessing church have looked like if it had formed before the Nazis took power? This seems the right question for our time, too. American Christians seem divided over who the good guys and bad guys really are. To some, the secular progressive left is the obvious modern equivalent of the Nazis, allowing a holocaust of the unborn, fostering an authoritarian culture on campuses and in newsrooms, demanding the state's validation and endorsement for every excess of the sexual revolution. That's actually more like the communists, but, whatever. To others, President Donald Trump and his MAGA movement are the baddies, preaching belligerent nationalism, demanding absolute loyalty to a singular leader, subverting the rule of law, and rewarding political violence. We should hesitate before thinking that we are living through 1933. Maybe the calling of the American church today isn't to mount a heroic resistance unto death against a singular moral evil that unites all people of good conscience in opposition. Maybe the calling of the church today is to recognize injustices and evils all around us, to maintain our independence, and above all, to be an advocate, not for one party or the other, but for lawfulness and peace among political tribes.
There are
getting somewhere?
Yeah, but there are good people and groups that are trying to do exactly that.
Yeah, there are.
Yeah.
Like, have you heard of the Holy Post podcast?
I have.
Yeah, we try to do that.
I was actually thinking of the AND campaign.
Oh yeah, them too. They're also doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they give the two of them give some suggestions at what a confessing church in this kind of point. They're also making the point that you need to be able to discern the times you're living in, because you may come, if you actually come to a 1933, then that kind of changes everything. But backing up and saying, we're not there yet. This is closer to 1923. A confessing church will counsel its members not to give their loyalty to a party, especially in times such as this. There is no compelling reason to identify yourself as a Republican or a Democrat. Do not give them the dignity of identifying as one of them. Favorite, Caitlin, pro, con? Should I?
Of that statement?
Yeah, of that statement.
This is where I might differ from him a little bit, both in that I think there can be great value to full participation in a political party. I mean, part of what I think he's arguing with this analogy with 1920s, 1930s Germany is if people had just really made these centrist parties more robust and given theological defenses of that could have helped avoid the extremes. You could also say people who could be more moderating voices in different parties can make a similar kind of impact. And it's hard because you're making a comparison with a context where there were multiple political parties, more than two, to a place where we only have two.
Right.
And I take his point about undue loyalty to political parties. I think we need a better account of what it means to participate in a political party or belong to a political party than we've often been given. I don't think we need to get to the point where we refuse to identify with a party. I think that can be, especially in local contexts, like local Republican, local Democratic politics can be quite different. It's obviously influenced by the national level, but it can be quite different at a local level, which is why you've seen some wins in places that are surprising. Like there are states where Democrats or Republicans, depending on the, sway of the state, can win at the local level because they trust the local party, but they can't win at the national level because they know that the national party is going to, get them involved in things they don't want to get involved into. So I would just say, I would be hesitant to say fully we don't associate or identify with political parties, but I take his point that the options given to us most of the time are to associate with a political party is to give complete loyalty and give over your sense of identity and community to it.
So you wouldn't necessarily advocate to someone, you have got a class of 18-year-olds sitting in front of you asking about a Christian and politics, Caitlin Shess. I don't know if that
happens sometimes.
I don't know if that's ever happened. And they say, should we associate with a political party today? You would say, no, you're Bonhoeffer in 1923, no parties.
I would say, are we talking about you getting involved in local politics? That might make sense. You're going to have to get some wisdom from your local community and from the people who are involved in politics locally to you. If what we're talking about is, should I associate as a part of my identity on social media with a particular party as someone who's not really involved in actual politics. I don't think that's necessary. And that's a lot of the model we've been given. I think the question is very different for people who are going to be robustly involved in politics, actually involved, not just consuming political media, but involved in local politics, than people who are just going to use this as a label to filter things that, like the news they receive and the way they identify online. Those are two very different questions.
How do you know, though, because right now, today, particularly on the Republican side, moderates are just being spat out. And go back 20, 30 years, and it was moderates being spat out of the Democratic Party over issues like abortion. Today, it's moderates being spat out of the Republican Party simply because of a lack of fealty to Donald Trump, personality-driven expulsion. So when you see that happening, at least at the national level, I guess it's not as much happening locally, doesn't that tell you you're going to have a hard time moderating a party that is rejecting all attempts at moderation?
I mean, that's why if it's a group of Christian 18-year-olds, most of them, if they are thinking about getting involved in politics, and I'm talking to students at CCCU schools that are like, I want to go into politics professionally. If some of them are going to run for local office, that's a very different question than like, how are you going to do this at the national level? And I think sometimes we have some hopelessness about the parties because of the information we're getting at the national level, which I totally understand. But there doesn't seem to be a great alternative currently to just saying like, yeah, I want really faithful, energetic, Christian college students to go out and after they graduate, be involved in local politics, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. I think that call me crazy, like at least that's a good thing, I think, for their communities.
I think there's also, though, the reality that our political parties are getting weaker and weaker. And
yeah, true.
I just heard Ezra Klein talking about the race in Nebraska this past year where an independent, very red state, an independent ran who probably more aligned with the Democratic Party in policies, but did not run as a Democrat, ran as an independent and almost won. And speculating that we might see more and more candidates running in very blue or very red states as independents.
Like disassociating.
Right, because the other political party's brand is so toxic in that place that you can't get far if you're associated with them. So it actually, whereas party affiliation used to be a huge asset because you had all the resources of the party behind you, now it's a liability and you're better off being independent, which may open the door for more independently minded Christians of conviction to run for office in different parts of the country based on a platform that is not beholden to one party or another, which I think would be a really good thing, but we'll see.
So Miller and Renew say a confessing church today in America needs a robust theology of civic engagement that teaches the moral good of Republican government, the rule of law, and constitutionalism. It would teach respect for pluralism, anti-utopianism, and the wisdom that comes from learning from the history of totalizing political religions. It would teach critical detachment from parties coupled with selective and narrow cooperation with them. Yes, no, Caitlin, yes.
She put her hands up like she
I know
was
the
cheering.
early part,
Yes.
the latter part.
Here's what's exciting to me about this, and this is the part of the piece that I again really agree with. And critical detachment is fine. I don't want to say let's not be involved in parties at all. But to Skye's point a moment ago of like, who knows what's going to happen with the parties in the United States? I have said this on the show before. I will say it again. It is just crucial, I think, for us to move beyond not only kind of Band-Aid responses to whatever the newest political crisis is, but to the point of this piece, move beyond the kind of the drama of the kind of moral clarity of the moment. And I love the Barmen Declaration. I have it literally on the wall next to me. I think it's a beautiful theological statement. But I think they're correct to say there's a kind of high we can get from being in this political moment that is very heightened, where we feel like we have not only moral clarity, but moral authority to just sort of say, like, here's what's true, and it's counter to everything you believe. And some of us, there's a reason we constantly are going back to the Nazis and comparing everything to Hitler and comparing everything to the Nazis, because the drama of being the Bonhoeffer against the Nazis is intoxicating. And what we need instead of the constant Band-Aid or the constant like clarion call of like, here's the Christian statement against everything that's going wrong, is the much smaller, slower, less dramatic, less exciting work of a political theology that not only gives us a sense of what it means to be a Christian in the world, what it means to honor government without giving it undue authority, the kind of formation, spiritual formation that people need to do this well. But the one thing I would say is sort of missing from this piece is a really robust sense of particular not just policies, but ideas about how communities should function that Christians have received over the decades. We aren't without resources for not just thinking about kind of the values that we should hold generally or the character that we should have, but really good ideas about what matters in a community and how they should function well. And we should return to that kind of approach of saying we need that basic theological foundation. There might be crises that pop up that give us an opportunity to return to those basics and say, this is what's being threatened. This is our response. But just constantly responding with like, Jesus is Lord, so that means you shouldn't be a dictator. Jesus is Lord, that means tyranny is wrong, isn't going to give us the robust foundation of like, we actually have something to say about how human communities best function and the spiritual formation we need to be good citizens and neighbors. We're not going to do that if we're constantly swept up in the drama of responding with this clarion call to this moral moment that makes us feel more important than actually gives us something to do.
We need like civic discipleship.
Yes.
Where are we going to get that? Unless someone produces a series of videos on civic discipleship.
Are you announcing something, Phil?
No, Caitlin is.
Oh.
Oh.
What this reminds me of, it's like telling Christians, like, so go to an area that most Christians don't find controversial at all, that the church is involved in, like helping people in their marriages. And it's a little bit like saying, when that prostitute comes and knocks on your hotel door,
Right.
are you going to have the moral, backbone to say no and stand firm in your conviction, your vow of your marriage?
Yes.
But that becomes the extent of sort of marital discipleship. Is will you withstand that moment? And it's not about the day in and day out caring for, loving, serving, steadfast, patient, forgiveness, and all the other stuff that actually goes into building a healthy marriage. It's only the crisis moment, are you going to stand firm? And the rest of it doesn't matter. Similarly, like, all right, when there's that gun to your head, are you going to say you belong to Jesus? When there is the dictator standing on the threshold of the White House, are you going to be like, wait a minute, I think that's a bad idea? Or are you actually going to cultivate a vision for Christian engagement in the public square in a way that brings flourishing to your neighbors, that can be faithful in a pluralistic environment, that believes in compromise, that you don't have to win every battle, and it's going to be okay? That's the day in and day out work of actually being a Christian in a plural democracy. A lot of the evangelical church is not talking about that. It's just crisis to crisis to crisis, and the barbarians are at the gate, and we have to stop whoever's on the ticket this year from getting in.
Right. Oh, my. They say a confessing church would teach its members to tell the truth, always, fully, and simply, without spin or guile, would teach its members to let your speech always be gracious. Boy, this confessing church is not going to have popular podcasts or YouTube channels. The church would warn its members against the dangers of the wisdom of the world. And above all, a confessing church would teach its members to discern the times and practice the ethic of self-scrutiny. You see the speck in your brother's eye, but you do not notice the log that is in your own. But if we point out our own flaws, how do we continue to paint the other side as Nazis?
Yeah, remove the Nazi from your eye.
Okay, we will post this article on the website and in the show notes. Give it a read. It's really interesting. It's really interesting. It's a different perspective, pushing against some of the extremism that we're hearing.
I do have to confess that when I was reading this, part of what came to mind was the work we did last year on the evangelical confession.
Yes.
That actually was inspired by the Barman Declaration. Yeah. And I helped draft it. If people didn't see it last year, it's at Evangelical Confession 2024. But it's a statement that touches on some of the stuff he's talking about.
Yeah, and somebody else actually made some animated little short videos on some of those principles.
Mm-hmm. Who could that be?
I don't know, but they were, so clever.
And I still think very relevant.
And still but it's too late because we're now up to 1933. Our moment has passed. There's nothing more that we can do. Good night, everyone. Bunker time. Hunker in your bunker. I'm going to write a new kid song. That'll be fun. Is that okay, Caitlin?
Because we're going to stop you.
You could sing it to the kids in your Sunday school.
Absolutely
We're going to hunker.
Not.
I think it needs a banjo. We're going to hunker in our bunker. So I think, and then I thunker. We had one of them dunkers in the church parking lot. Hey! So we will hunker in our bunker. And our civilization is sunker, and you may think they're Nazis, but they're not.
And now it's time for Silly Songs with Hitler.
Stop.
We will see you next week. Hang out for the guest. It's all going to be okay. We will confess the church. And and we'll be back next week. See ya. Today's episode was sponsored by the Leaders Way podcast. Do you ever wonder how Christians can rise to the occasion and be leaders in our broken world? Then you might like to come along on the journey of the Leaders Way podcast. On the Leaders Way, Dr. Hannah Black and Dr. Brandon Nappy, lecturers at Yale, interview leaders and wonder about spirituality, theology, leadership, and how the church can be innovative in meeting the needs of our time. If you're looking for a place to start, check out the episode about spiritual formation and politics with Caitlin Chess. In fact, why don't you queue up the Leader's Way for when you run out of new Holy Post episodes? Join us as we cultivate hope and seek to become the church that meets the needs of the 21st century. Look up the Leader's Way podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to start listening now. Today's episode is sponsored by Bushnell University. Do you want to lead faithfully in a chaotic world? Bushnell University's Masters of Arts in Theology and Culture is designed to equip Christians, pastors, ministry leaders, and workplace believers to be transformative in their communities. Guided by Dr. A.J. Swoboda. You may recognize him from episode 454 when he talked to Skye about deconstruction and doubt. Dr. Swoboda guides this 2-year program that blends deep theological formation with practical learning. With 2 immersive week-long residencies and flexible online coursework, you'll learn how to be resilient and lead others into deeper faith. Learn more at bushnell.edu and start your journey today. That's bushnell.edu.
No Small Endeavor started as a live variety show in Nashville in 2008. It was a surprising mix of theology, social ethics, and brilliant music, hosted by Lee Camp, a professor of theology and ethics at Lipscomb University. Since then, No Small Endeavor has exploded to become a sensation, attracting the most respected, award-winning artists and musicians in the country, along with best-selling authors, philosophers, scientists, artists, and theologians. And in 2020, the show launched a long-form interview podcast, and that has since led to a weekly radio program that is now syndicated on NPR throughout the country. I wanted to have Lee Camp on the show to talk about the development of No Small Endeavor, but more importantly, to discuss his approach as a Christian to hosting conversations with such diverse collections of guests around the most important questions of our day, including what does it really mean to live a good life, what is true happiness, and how can we flourish as a society with so much disagreement? As I said, Lee Camp is a professor at Lipscomb. He got his MDiv degree from Abilene Christian University and his PhD from Notre Dame. He's the author of numerous books, and in my view, he exemplifies what it means to be a faithful follower of Christ in our post-Christian context without resorting to fear or anger, but instead is full of curiosity and courage. Here is my conversation with Lee Camp. Lee Camp, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thank you, Skye. Good to be with you. Appreciate the invitation.
It's great to be with you. I want to begin by talking about just the origin of No Small Endeavor. How did you go from just doing ethics and theology at Lipscomb to a variety show on NPR? Like, tell me the genesis of all this.
Yeah. Well, my wife, Laura, and I were down at the famed Ryman Auditorium in Nashville in December 31, 2006. So it was a New Year's Eve show that Garrison Keillor's Pre-Home Companion was putting on. And I listened to Keillor for years, and but that night was just especially joyous. And after it was over, I had this terrible, horrific idea, which was, what if we did like a theological variety show? And of course, it sounds like a horrible idea. But we started pursuing it, and we found enough people in Nashville that thought it was a really interesting idea to help fund it on the front end. And we got connected with some really fantastic musicians here in Nashville that were kind of some of the best in the recording area, recording space. And so we just started doing this thing, and we started in a really small little auditorium on campus that, we had 100, 150 of my friends that I could convince to come see the first one. And then we just started doing it quarterly, and it grew. And by the end of our second or third year, we started doing a big show every year at the Ryman Auditorium itself. And then in 2020, with the pandemic, we shifted toward more online stuff and then began a long format interview podcast. And then that got us to deal with Nashville Public Radio by the end of the year. And then in the last year, 18 months or so, we've been on syndication on public radio through Public Radio Exchange, PRX. So it's been a really fun ride, and I've loved it.
It sounds fun, and I can't imagine you expected it to grow the way it did.
No.
What was the most surprising turn from the idea coming from Prairie Home Companion live event to where you are now? Was there a moment that you went, oh, looking back, that was really the turning point where this thing took off?
Well, anything in my experience is that most things in the arts is always like you can kind of see that you might be able to make it through the next show, and then slowly it began to say, okay, we can make it through the next half year, and then we can make it through the next year, and then in turn, and finally you get enough people interested in saying, okay, well, we can kind of have some financial stability here. But I think one of the thing that bubbled up in my mind when you asked that question was, for years we had this one particular house band, and they were literally some of the best players in Nashville. All sorts of awards to their name in the recording industry. And I remember our bass player, who was out touring with, I won't say the names of people he was out touring with, but like super high profile people. And he started talking about how he was going to have to try to work his schedule on this particular tour so he could do his best to get back and do one of our shows that we were doing in Nashville. And I thought, why does he care about this? And I started realizing about that time, there was another friend of mine who had a studio here in Nashville. And I remember seeing him at the end of one of our shows that we had done on campus, and he was down talking to these musicians, all of whom he knew. And I walked over to him, he's a real tall guy, and I walked over to him, and he had tears in his eyes and was kind of wiping tears out of his face. And he said, Lee, I do this for a living. But he said, but this is just different. And so there was those kinds of experiences. So there's something when you put together music with substantive questions and you try to do it in a way that's hospitable and that doesn't take yourself too seriously, and you try to use humor to kind of disarm people rather than poke at people, and really smart conversations about things that people care about. It's just a sort of mode of communication that we don't see happen very often. And I just think it's resonated with a lot of people in ways that's been really fun.
Well, I think that journey sounds a lot like what we've discovered at Holy Post Media. We've talked about this before. Like it is when you have important conversations about with really interesting people, and it is disarming and there's some humor. Like it's kind of a magic recipe, and it seems to work. You mentioned at the beginning when you were back in 2006, you had this idea of what if we did a variety show with theology? I'm assuming the early years you just had theologians on or Bible scholars, something like that. When did the show go from just limited to theology to these broader ideas? Because you have a whole bunch of diverse guests on now, many of whom are not Christian and come from very different backgrounds or disciplines. When and why did you transition from just theology to those broader topics?
Yeah. Well, we actually, from the very first show, had, so I'm thinking about a particular historian that we had interview clips on the first live show that we did, who was not a Christian and was actually a bit disdainful of Christianity, best I could tell. But he had some really important stories to tell that people needed to know about this topic that we were talking about. And so I think that we've kind of taken the approach all along that there are lots of incredible people in the world who have studied long and hard about given topics. And if they're people of good faith and they have something important to say on the topic that we're dealing with, then we ought to be hospitable and welcome them. And what's been so fascinating is to see the reciprocity of that. Like when you treat people with hospitality and good faith, they then begin to trust you, right, in a way that they begin to open up. And so it's really fascinating to try to learn those rules of hospitality and the way you can make space for something to happen that otherwise couldn't happen.
Have you been the recipient of criticism because of that? Having people on the show that are divergent from your views or from Christian orthodoxy or anything? Or do people generally appreciate the hospitality with which you're trying to approach this? Or do you get stones thrown at you from one side or the other.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the people that have stayed around with us for all these years are quite comfortable with that. But definitely, I mean, I've been told stories about people getting up and walking out of a show because they were put out by something that they found too conservative. And I've heard stories of people getting up and walking out because of something they found too liberal, right? So that's definitely come from all angles. And these days we get to have some pretty high profile people on these shows. And so it begins to be easy for certain people to throw stones at them. But what's so fascinating is like the last big show that we did in Nashville was at the Schermerhorn Symphony Center. And I mean, we had Amy Grant, and we had David Brooks and Sheryl Crow. And I doubt you're going to find a stage that has those three people on the same stage together anywhere else. But what was so fun was watching the way all three of those people liked engaging with, listening to, and talking with the other. And how, I'll always remember this scene of watching Sheryl Crow, this self-identified progressive, looking with such, I would say, almost like adoration, looking at Amy Grant singing that night. And the same thing with Amy Grant and Sheryl Crow. And Amy Grant sent me a message saying that she was so excited that you had this kind of David Brooks, self-identified conservative of some sort with the New York Times, and Sheryl Crow, the self-identified liberal. And so I think it's just something about when you can really have a sort of mutual respect from people coming from different angles, that for the people, and again, that doesn't fit everybody. A lot of people aren't interested in that, but a lot of people are interested in it. And so I think it's trying to make space for the people that are interested in it that makes it so enjoyable.
I don't expect you to name names, but have you invited people on the show who just say, absolutely not, I'm not going to share a stage with someone from that point of view or that side?
I can't remember anybody ever saying that particular thing. There is a well-known artist who once said yes to a show that we were doing at the Ryman, and then he got word around town that we were a religious show, and so we had already announced he was going to be on the show, and so he sent word through his manager that he wasn't going to do it. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, could we at least talk on the phone? He said yes. And so we talked, and he asked me lots of questions about what are you doing, why are you doing it, and all this sort of stuff. And frankly, when he showed up for rehearsal that day of the show, he was clearly not into this, and he had a bad attitude. He was kind of, he just wasn't happy to be there. But it was fascinating to watch his transformation over the course of the night, because first, when he heard the band, he like after he ran into he bowed to the band after his first rehearsal, and then we always sing this old class traditional spiritual, the welcome table, at the end of those big shows. And so I'll always remember, us singing that at the end of the show. And I took the first verse, and then he was taking the second verse, and I looked over him, and he had this beautiful, beautiful smile on his face singing the second verse of that song. And then after the show was over, he said, I may just have to come over there and see how you're teaching these theology classes.
Wow.
And so, it's that sort of, again, it's wonderful to get to do that kind of stuff and to see people process it themselves in real time sometimes.
Why do you think this value on hospitality isn't more celebrated in a lot of American Christianity right now? But it seems like, in my experience, a lot of the places I go, there's such a spirit of fear and threat that is in opposition to the kind of hospitality and welcome that you guys are expressing. Where's that coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly I'm self-censoring, or I'm thinking about how to say this in a way that I think is helpful. I grew up in a context that was a highly sectarian Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so far as Christianity was concerned, there was this one type of Christian and everybody else was not Christian, right? We were the only ones. And so we did not know what it meant to be hospitable to people who had different convictions than we did, while at the same time being able to be hospitable around other measures or other aspects of life, right? So there was a sort of inhospitality with regard to religious conviction or theological conviction, but a sort of hospitality with regard to anything else you could find to latch onto, social realities or whatever. And so I knew very acutely the way in which a narrow understanding of what the truth was could lead to a very sharp difference between us and them. And I saw the way that was much to my own personal detriment. And as I have been able to learn to do better, how enriching it's been to my own life. But I do think that there's a lot of people that are just afraid, right? If you go down that road, you're afraid you're going to lose yourself. But, one of the things that I've discovered, and I know this relates to some of your interest and background, but years ago, I had done a interfaith lecture. And to show you how big religion is in the Bible Belt, there was a story on the front page, top fold of the Tennessean the next morning that was talking about that lecture, and it completely mischaracterized what I did in that lecture. And so by the end of the day, I had emails from California to Manhattan to Tel Aviv to New Zealand calling me every name in the book. But what it did for me was it made me want to go understand Muslims better and Islamic theology. And so then I ended up writing my second book was on Christianity and Islam on war and peace questions. And what I discovered in doing that work was that I discovered how many wonderful, I got to meet some really beautiful, wonderful Muslim theologians who extended me great, generous hospitality in Istanbul and Jerusalem and so forth, and how beautiful their faith was. And at the same time, it also helped me understand Christianity better. I feel like I understood better who I was claiming to be as a Christian, precisely because I had this exchange with these Muslims. And so I think that's the thing I keep going back to is how can we help people realize you can actually understand yourself better by having conversation with people who are different. And to keep yourself in this kind of narrow kind of place of fear, you end up really not knowing who you are and the potential beauty that there is in your own sort of faith claims.
I remember years ago talking to some young adults, and one of them told me this story that she and her college roommate they met in college, and her roommate had come from a very sheltered sectarian sort of Christian background, and she had come from a more cosmopolitan, let's say, Christian background where she knew lots of people from a diversity of backgrounds. And they came into this college environment, and for the first time in her college roommate's life, she started meeting people who were Jewish, Muslim, Roman Catholic, atheist, progressive, whatever, LGBTQ. And she met these people, and a lot of them turned out to be really wonderful people. And she didn't know how to square that with the fact that she was raised in this very sectarian environment that told her all these people were not just wrong, but dangerous.
Yeah.
And so her way of dealing with it was, well, I guess I have to give up my Christianity because it's clearly not true. Versus the other one who had been raised in this diverse environment said, no. I was raised in an environment where I met all these kinds of people, and yet I still believe my faith is true. And I have something to learn and gain from my friendships with all these different people.
Yeah.
And it speaks to that, the danger of the highly sectarian, isolated, protectionist view is we think we're guarding our faith. We think we're protecting our kids, especially by making sure they're not exposed to anything that would challenge their ideas or views or beliefs. But it's a little bit like, there's studies that show that kids who grow up in very sterile environments end up having worse allergies because they never build up any immunity. So anyway, I'm curious to know, given your background of this sectarian environment, when did you begin to have that broader view and that openness, that curiosity that marks so much of what you're doing now?
Yeah. Well, I was raised in Alabama, and again, I interviewed Nadia Bolz-Weber recently, and she and I were raised in the same tradition. And so I started with her asking, what are things that were beautiful and good for you in that tradition, and what are things that were damaging and constructive? And I always think that's an important thing to hold on to, right? Is that even though there's certain things about it that I sharply critique and I reject, there were beautiful things about it too. And among them, a kind of sense of community and love and support that I'll always be grateful for. But as I left and went to college, I had a mentor in my junior year. He was an administrator in the school. And he would just meet with me and a friend of mine. We were both in student government, and that was the excuse for us meeting on a weekly basis. And he would just ask us questions that we couldn't answer and questions we never thought about. And then he took me to a gathering of Christians from a lot of different diverse backgrounds. And these were Catholics and mainline Protestants and evangelicals and so forth. And at break, I remember saying to him, I've never heard people who are Christians of this, this variety. And I can't deny from what I hear them say that they are Christians. And I can't deny that they have had some sort of real encounter with God and that they love God, And so that was a huge moment for me of where my sectarianism began to break down just based upon my lived experience. And my lived experience couldn't uphold that anymore. And so then, it went from there. But it's definitely was a long process. Well, I'll say this. Intellectually, it was not a long process. I mean, it took me, 2 to 3, 4, 5 years. I went on to seminary. And so between my last couple of years in college and my seminary years, intellectually, it wasn't a long process of shedding that sectarianism. What was a longer process was a sort of emotional tale of that sort of isolationism and or the shame that came from that. And that took me well into my 40s, I think, to come to terms with, including a lot of therapy and doing stuff like EMDR and all this kind of stuff, of where I was shocked really about, when I was doing some of that therapy, how long the tail of that shame had been in my life. And so that was a very long process.
Wow. Talk a little bit about what's next, because you guys are doing a tour for no small endeavor, and it features Malcolm Gladwell. What's your connection to Malcolm Gladwell? I mean, I had one. I really hate myself for this. I was at an event many, many years ago when I was working for Christianity Today, and Malcolm Gladwell was one of the speakers there. And I got to sit down with him at a lunch table in this event and share a meal. And I hadn't at that point read any Malcolm Gladwell's books. So I didn't appreciate the time I had with him. And I wasn't prepared to ask him the questions I would have asked him now. So I'm jealous that you get him for this tour. But what's your connection to Malcolm Gladwell, and what is this tour that you guys are going to be doing together?
Yeah, well, the tour is Malcolm and Drew Holcomb, who's a very respected Americana artist, and a bus full of musicians and producers and so forth. We have 12 plus of us on the road for 7 dates in April. We'll be going out and doing a show. And so the way I got connected with Malcolm was that a year and a half ago or so, I weaseled my way into finding his personal email address. And I just thought, how could I write? What kind of offer could I make to Malcolm to get him to come to Nashville to do a live show that I think would be interesting to him? And so I knew enough about his work, and I knew enough about his love of Nashville and Nashville music culture that I fashioned it in a way that I thought, I think he will be interested in this, including telling him that Vince Gill was going to be on the show, and because one of his episodes was about Vince, one of Vince's songs and so forth. And so I just pitched it in a way that I thought he'd be interested. So we got him to come, and it was a lovely night, and it was a lovely enough night to him that he decided, I think I'll go out and try this on the road a bit. So we're excited about it.
That's fantastic. I mean, he is one of my favorite writers, and I just appreciate so much the way he weaves together different things into an accessible but entertaining format, which is so rare. And as a writer myself, I'm like, oh, if I could reach not his sales numbers, but his skill as a writer, I would be so thrilled. So you guys are going to be in Louisville, Indianapolis, Grand Rapids, Baltimore, Greensboro, North Carolina, Columbus, Ohio, and Reading, Pennsylvania, all in the course of a month. Are you just going to be on the road nonstop? Is that the plan?
Well, we're doing the first 3, Louisville, Indianapolis, and Grand Rapids. It starts like April 7 or 8, and then we'll do those 3. Then we'll take a break, and Easter's the next weekend. Then we get back on the road the weekend after. But we will cram them into two long weekends.
And are you going to continue, I assume, the ones in Nashville?
Yeah, we'll still do. We've got another big show scheduled back at the Skirmer Horn in November, and then we got a couple of other kind of private shows. These days we do shows for like private fundraising events and things of that sort. So we've got several more of those this year as well in Nashville and outside of Nashville.
Is there a guest? I always joke that my white whale is Stephen Colbert, that I would love to have him on the Holy Post, and the audience knows I've tried in different ways. But is there a white whale for you, a guest that you're like, oh, this is the person that I'd love to have a conversation with more than anyone else that you've not been able to get yet?
Yeah. I definitely have several that I have on the list. I mean, one's Bruce Springsteen, and one's Bono, and also Stephen Colbert. We actually had a conversation with Stephen Colbert about coming last year, and his schedule didn't work out. But maybe one
closer than I got,
and maybe one of these days we'll see.
Closer than I got. I know a number of folks down in Nashville through various things. David French is on our show every month, and he talks about the Nashville reality. How does No Small Endeavor and the hospitality you're showing there and the diversity of guests that you have on, how does that fit Nashville, and how is it a challenge for the Nashville environment?
I definitely, my personal experience is that it definitely hits both ends of that spectrum. I mean, there are ways in which there are a lot of people that love it, and certainly there are certain contexts that find it challenging and or threatening, and sometimes those are the same institutions and people, because navigating, I mean, you and Phil know very well the sort of challenges of navigating evangelical Christian world, and the Bible Belt is certainly a very intense space in that regard. But at the same time, there are a lot of people that, it's like the kind of middle, that David French even talks about a lot, right? You got the extremes, but there's a larger group in the middle that really are quite happy to have these kinds of contexts and settings. So I think a lot of it is continue to try to show people respect wherever they're coming from. Know that you're not going to diss people, and know that you're going to be kind and gracious. That continues to go a long ways. But I'll also say that there's just sometimes you never do really know what all's going on in the background, right? So I've certainly had personal experiences where, I think that something may be about something I've written or something I've said, and you find out later, well, Lee, it's really not all about you. There are other things going on, And so it's always hard to know really what's going on unless somebody tells you. And sometimes even when they tell you, you don't know.
Was there a guest or a topic perhaps that you, in advance, you knew that this was going to be poking the bear a little bit, and you and your team were prepared for what was coming? Something come to mind?
I would say that our issues around sexuality continue to be so intense in the Bible Belt. And then outside the Bible Belt, it's like if you're still worrying about that stuff, then we don't know if we're going to worry about you, even if you're kind of in the middle or left of center. But you're still worrying about that, then we're not so sure we want to be engaged with you. And so it's just, there's those kinds of issues continue to be so difficult to navigate because, I've got very close relationships with people all across that spectrum. And so that definitely is one that we continue to try to figure out. How can we best navigate this? And it's not always quite so clear how you always best navigate it.
Yeah, I've shared that. We talked earlier, you asked me in the interview we did on your show, when do we choose to wade into difficult topics. And that's one that our team here at the Holy Post has, like you, we have friends and family and people all across the spectrum, and we recognize the nuance and difficulty of this topic. But so much of the rhetoric in our society is exactly what you're describing. It's either, oh, you haven't settled this completely in your mind and you're all the way over here, or the fact that you're even having the conversation at all is off-putting to certain groups. Right. So yeah, it's one of those that is so important to our culture, to our families, our faith, all these, and yet I don't know too many people that have modeled a great way to have those conversations other than privately, where there's a lot of empathy and understanding and listening and nuance. But to do it on a stage or to do it on a microphone, it's incredibly hard. And it just feels like you're opening yourself up to attacks from every angle. Yeah. But if you figure it out, let me know.
Well, I mean, one of the things that we have done is we have, in effect, how should I put this? We've not talked about the issue. I'm putting that in scare quotes for people who can't see me. We've not talked about the issue. I'll put that in scare quotes. But it's been very important to me that we show and welcome, I mean, for example, one of the most prominent lesbian singer-songwriters in Nashville has been on our show several times, Mm-hmm. It's like, one of the most prominent, poets, gay in the UK, has been on our show a couple of times. And so it's like, and the point was not to talk about LGBTQ stuff. The point, the point was these are incredible human beings, and we want to hear what it is they have to sing and what it is they have to say.
Right. And this goes beyond the sexuality and gender or marriage issues. There's this vibe in so much of our culture right now that, to use your word, hospitality is somehow endorsement. That if you have somebody on your show and their theological view or their political view or their scientific view or whatever their view is doesn't conform to your audience, they get angry that because you're platforming them, it's understood that you're endorsing everything this person stands for, believes, or thinks, or whatever. And it's like, no, we're having a conversation. It's the way families work. There's diversity of views and opinions, but to host them feels like endorsement. We've had not quite the variety of people you've had on your show, but we've had Muslims on this show. We've had atheists on this show. We've had openly gay clergy on this show. We've had, all kinds of different folks. And invariably when we do something like that, a certain segment will react and go, well, you're endorsing it. And it's like, well, no, I'm having a conversation with somebody, but people take it as full-throated endorsement of whatever the view might be. So it's hard. And I applaud you for navigating that and figuring out how to do it in a way that makes both the guests want to come back and an audience want to engage. And it feels like that's exactly what the church ought to be doing. Lee, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Skye. I appreciate it. It'd be great to be with you.
And I'm so glad that there are more voices out there like yours that are modeling this and creating these forums for all kinds of folks in this diverse country to come together and have really good conversations. And the fact that they're being hosted by somebody of faith like you, all the better. And grateful for what you're doing and hope to catch one of those shows on the road here soon.
We would love to have you and love any of your listeners to join us, and very grateful as well for the work you and Phil are doing. And we need more of it, more of the thinky and funny engagement with the world.
Amen. We'll put a link in the show notes so people can get more information about the tour or if they want to see you down in Nashville. Great. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.